The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events discussed are based on documented records and scholarly research. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of the events portrayed. Viewer discretion is very much advised. There is a small square in Edinburgh's Old Town that most tourists walk right past without ever even stopping. It sits just off the Royal Mile, tucked behind the university's medical buildings. It is unremarkable in a way that places with very remarkable histories often are. A few historical plaques and some academic architecture. It's the kind of quiet institutional atmosphere that communicates serious work happens here. And it has always happened here. And that is true, because serious work did happen here. It's just that some of that serious work required a steady supply of human corpses, and the people supplying them were not particular about how those corpses were obtained either. I'm talking about Surgeons' Square in Edinburgh, the anatomical epicenter of early modern medicine, the place where the science of the human body was built and where the market for human bodies was built right alongside it, with much less fanfare and a lot more violence. Welcome to Dastardly Places. I'm April Rain, and today we're going to walk through the geography of the body trade, the specific streets and buildings where medicine decided that some people's deaths were more useful than others, and where the line between science and murder turned out to be thinner than anyone ever wanted to admit. Surgeons' Square in Edinburgh is not, today, a particularly dramatic place. It occupies a small area just south of the High Street, adjacent to what is now Edinburgh's Old College, in a neighborhood that has been academic and medical in character for the better part of 3 centuries. In the early 19th century, the period that concerns us most, Surgeons' Square was the operational center of Edinburgh's anatomy trade. The city was, at that point, one of the foremost centers of medical education in the English-speaking world. The Edinburgh Medical College attracted students from Britain, from the American colonies, and the former colonies. Its anatomists were among the most celebrated in Europe, and its surgical instruction was considered the gold standard. And its anatomy instruction? Well, that required cadavers. A great many cadavers. Way more than the law was prepared to provide. The specific buildings of Surgeons' Square, those anatomy theaters, the lecture halls, and the dissection rooms, well, that's where those cadavers ended up. And they arrived at night, in sacks, carried by men who were paid not to ask questions and not to be seen. And the anatomists who received them were, in most cases, equally careful not to ask questions. The transaction was understood, and the market, it had its own etiquette. The Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, founded in 1505, still operates on the south side of Surgeons' Square. Its building is an elegant neoclassic structure that houses a museum, a library, and the administrative offices of one of the oldest surgical organizations in the world. The museum contains instruments, anatomical models, and historical artifacts from centuries of Scottish surgical practice. It does not have an exhibit on where the bodies came from. And that is not unusual. Institutions rarely curate their own complicity, but the complicity is in the archive, for anyone who wants to find it. It's the records of the anatomy schools, the receipts, the correspondence between anatomists that dance carefully around the specifics of procurement while making the economics perfectly clear. The paper trail of an industry that everybody knew about and that the law was, for decades, carefully structured to ignore. To understand Surgeon Square, you have to understand the geography surrounding it. Because the body trade was not an abstract market. It operated through specific places, specific routes, and specific sites of extraction that were as legible to Edinburgh's inhabitants in 1820 as the regular street grid. The primary sources were graveyards. Edinburgh's historic graveyards, Greyfriars Kirkyard most famously, but also St. Cuthbert's, Canongate Kirkyard, and others throughout the city. They were the original operational hunting grounds for the resurrection men, the men who dug up recently buried and delivered them, for payment, to anatomy schools. Greyfriars Kirkyard today is one of Edinburgh's most visited sites. It is famous for its association with Greyfriars Bobby, the small terrier who supposedly guarded its owner's grave for 14 years after his death. And that story has been made into films and commemorated with a bronze statue that visitors actually line up to photograph. The kirkyard is atmospheric, ancient, and genuinely beautiful in a way that old Scottish graveyards are. They are full of elaborate 17th century tombstones, and they have mossy, weathered stones. And those stones make people feel historical feelings. It is less famous for its mort safes. A mort safe is an iron cage or iron-reinforced stone slab that was placed over graves to prevent exhumation. They were a different response to the body trade. Families who could afford them paid to have their dead protected from the resurrection men. Mort safes are still visible in Greyfriars Kirkyard today. They are scattered among the older graves, and they're heavy and rusted, and they are matter of fact about what they were built to prevent. Those mort safes are the physical record of a community's terror. The people of Edinburgh knew what was happening to their dead. They responded with iron, and the ones who couldn't afford iron, they responded with grief and helplessness, and occasionally with riots. The anatomy riots of the early 19th century. Those events happened in Edinburgh, London, and other British cities where crowds were attacking anatomy schools, and in some cases, the anatomists themselves. This was a popular response to the body trade made legible in the street geography of that period. These were not abstract protests. They were specific acts of rage at specific buildings where specific people were doing specific things to the bodies of that community's dead. And those buildings are still there. The riots are in the historical record, and the mort safes are still in the kirkyard. The tour guides mostly talk about Greyfriars Bobby. On the night of October 31st, 1827, a man named William Hare discovered the body of a fellow lodger who had died of natural causes in his boarding house. And he found that that man's body could be sold to the anatomy school at Surgeon Square for £7 and 10 shillings. That was a significant sum of money in 1827 Edinburgh. Hare and his associate William Burke delivered that body to the anatomy school run by Dr. Richard Knox at 10 Surgeon Square. Knox paid without asking any questions, because after all, the market does have its etiquette. Over the following year, Burke and Hare murdered 16 people, lodgers, acquaintances, strangers, and they delivered their bodies to Knox at that same address. The method that they developed was suffocation, because it left no marks of violence on the body, because those marks would have raised inconvenient questions. And they also gave the English verb to burke, which means to suppress or to murder quietly. The address of 10 Surgeon Square no longer exists in the same form that it had in 1828. The building where Knox conducted his anatomy classes, where Burke and Hare delivered their victims, where the transaction between the body trade and medical science was most visible and catastrophically exposed. That specific structure is gone. It was absorbed into the university's expanding medical campus over the subsequent decade since 1828. The square itself is still there, and the geography of the transaction is still there. You can stand in Surgeon Square and understand with reasonable precision where you are standing relative to where Burke and Hare delivered their 16th victim in 1828. The victim whose discovery led to their arrest and to the exposure of the entire system that had made all of this possible. And as we discussed in the main episode, Dr. Knox was never prosecuted. His name appeared nowhere in the subsequent legal proceedings. He had asked no questions, kept no incriminating records, and maintained the precise ethical distance that the market's etiquette required. He lost his position in Edinburgh eventually. The public outrage was too sustained for his career to survive. But he was never charged with anything. So the system protected him. Because the system needed him. Because the system needed what he did. Because the anatomy schools needed bodies and the law provided almost none. Everyone above a certain social station that understood this and looked away for long enough, that looking away produced Burke and Hare. And there is no clean way to draw the line between the murderers and the institution that had created the conditions for them. There is a plaque in Surgeon Square acknowledging the history of anatomy in Edinburgh. It does not mention Knox by name, and it does not mention Burke and Hare by name. It describes the history of medical education in appropriately general terms. The archive, on the other hand, is way more specific, because the archive always is. The Burke and Hare murders led to the Anatomy Act of 1832. That's the piece of legislation that was supposed to solve the body problem by providing anatomy schools with a legal supply of cadavers. But what the Anatomy Act actually did was formalize a principle that the body trade had operated on informally. And that principle is that the bodies of the poor were available for medical science in a way that the bodies of the wealthy were not. The Act specified that the unclaimed bodies of people who died in workhouses, hospitals, and other public institutions could be used for anatomical dissection. Unclaimed was a very flexible category in practice. It often meant that bodies had not been claimed within a short window. And in an era when poor families might not have had the resources or the information to claim their dead properly. The workhouses that provided the significant proportion of the Act's cadaver supply were institutions where the poor died in numbers that made individual tracing very, very difficult. And the geography of this provision is important. The workhouses of Edinburgh and of London and of every British city where the Anatomy Act operated were specific places. They were buildings in specific neighborhoods, and the people who died in them came from specific communities, and the routes by which their bodies traveled from the workhouse to the anatomy school, now legally sanctioned rather than conducted in darkness, were routes through the city that everyone could trace if they just chose to look. The poor neighborhoods of Edinburgh's Old Town, the closes and wynds of the medieval city, the overcrowded tenements of the Canongate and the Grass Market were the source. Surgeon Square was the destination. The Anatomy Act drew a legal line between them and called it science. The building that housed the workhouse where many of these deaths occurred, the Edinburgh Charity Workhouse, later the Old Town Poorhouse, is gone now, and it's been replaced by a much more urban and modern development. But its location is documented, and you can map the route, and you can understand the geography of who was considered available. The geography did not end in 1832. It changed its legal clothing, and it continued. The postscript episode this week follows the story to Henrietta Lacks and to the documented present. But the origin point, the specific square in Edinburgh's Old Town where the principle was established that some bodies belong to science, is still there. Still there, and still not sufficiently marked. Surgeons Square is not a tourist destination. It does not appear prominently on the Edinburgh walking maps. The Royal College of Surgeons has a museum that is genuinely worth visiting for its medical history. And that same Royal College of Surgeons is honest about some of its past, but very careful about other parts of it. What the square does not have, and what it has never had, is a memorial to the people whose bodies built the medical knowledge that the buildings around it represent. The resurrection victims, the murder victims, the workhouse dead, and the people who were taken with or without legal sanctions. Because the institution needed them, and the law decided that their lives made them available. Their names are in some cases recoverable from records. Burke and Hare's victims are documented, and we know who some of them were, where they came from, and what lives they were living before they encountered William Burke in a lodging house or on the street. The resurrection victims are harder to trace, because the resurrection men were not in the habit of keeping records, and the anatomy schools were not in the habit of asking for them. But they were people. Fully, completely, recognizably people. People who lived in that city, in those streets, and in the closes and winds that are still there. Still navigatable, and still carrying the layout of a world that decided what they were worth. The square is still there. Walk it, knowing what you're walking through. This has been The Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain, and Dastardly Places drops weekly, because history happened somewhere, and somewhere is usually still there. Stay dark.